Again, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here today and joining us for the Bystander Intervention Mixtape to prevent systemic and intercommunal violence, grounding our work in empathy, reconciliation, and racial justice activism. This is a two-part mini-series. Today we are kicking off session 1. We'll be here from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time, and we are joined by our colleagues at Black Women's Blueprint, who we're going to turn it over to very shortly to lead us in the session today. A couple quick notes on how to use Zoom and how we use Zoom on this web conferences for folks who may be new. We'll be engaging you with the text chat throughout the session today. Please feel free to drop your questions in there as we go along. Our presenters will keep an eye on the chat and we'll be pulling out certain questions if it makes sense to do so at the time. And we might have some time for questions at the end if we don't quite get there. But feel free to drop them in the chat along the way, and we'll do our best to get to them when we can. For folks who are having internet connection issues, you can always call in. That information should have been in the Zoom invitation. And just to let folks know, if you do end up calling in, or if maybe you're calling in now, it doesn't automatically mute you for some reason. So we always just keep an eye on folks and go through and mute if we're getting any background noise or things like that. We have closed captioning today by our friends at Aberdeen Captioning. If you'd like to access the closed captioning, you can go ahead and click the little closed caption icon at the bottom of your information bar, and it should start streaming across your screen. If you have any issues with accessing closed captioning or any other just tech glitches today, and it's something we might be able to help you out with, you can always send me, Sarah, a private message, and we will do what we can to get you squared away. And for our web conference guidelines, a couple of things. I think first and foremost, and we say this all the time, we really want you all to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, take breaks if you need to, be on camera or off camera, engage kind of as much or as little as you want. I know that we all spend a lot of time on Zoom and web conferences these days. So just do what you got to do to take care of yourself, eat, drink, whatever makes you feel best. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later when we hand it over to our presenters today, but we are going to be, I think when we have conversations about racial justice, we want to make sure that folks are being open-minded, that we're making sure that we're maintaining this virtual space as a safe one for everyone. So we invite you to join us in that as well. So we are the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. You can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And if you have any TA needs or requests, you can always send us an email at info@calcasa.org. Again, I use she, her pronouns. I'm with CalCasa. I'm a project coordinator. I work primarily on our rape prevention and education project. And I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Jessie, to introduce herself and do a bit of a welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie Town Cardenas, and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm a consultant with the CalCasa, and I work a lot with the rape prevention and education program, and then other preventionists. It's really, I really love seeing all the preventionists coming up in the chat and seeing your photos and remembering the last time we talked and saw each other on Zoom. And I'm looking forward to being back in person with people. So I just want to say a little bit, and I'm really excited and grateful to have Farah and Savannah here to share their time and expertise with us on looking at bystander intervention strategy in a really effective and different way than we have in the past. Bystander intervention is something that is so often included in our prevention programs, but also having worked in the field for a long time and gotten to talk to so many people in my own organizations and now across the state, it's also so often a topic that many of our participants and young people just really don't connect to in the ways that we would want. And so, particularly for those young people who are in communities that are marginalized, that experience violence and oppression from the very authority figures that we're kind of asking them to ask for help. Um, and so many of our traditional kind of bystander approaches were really developed for, kind of middle school, younger high school, those in typical schools, white kind of middle America. And so, of course, they don't um, connect with all of the young people that we're working with. And I think the other limitation that we found is that as we are often looking more and more for strategies that change our whole community, for strategies that change our systems, bystander is really often an individual strategy that doesn't take into account the systems, the communities, the social norms that young people are living in. And so we're really grateful to Black Women's Blueprint and to Farah and Savannah for coming in and presenting to us their bystander mixtape that really gives an alternative and a solution, not an alternative, but a solution to the limitations of the bystander intervention strategies that we have currently been using. And so I am going to hand it back over to Sarah because you're going to do a deeper introduction for Farah and Savannah. And again, just welcome. Please feel free to reach out to us through the chat, to everyone or individually to Sarah or I. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jessie. So without any further delay, we're really excited to welcome Black Women's Blueprint and with Savannah and Farah. And right before we pass it over, we're going to tell you a little bit about our speakers and the organization for those of you who may not be familiar. Black Women's Blueprint envisions fostering human connection and forging paths to peace, holistic reconciliation, social, economic, and environmental justice, co-creating a vibrant and safe community where women and all people can live lives of sovereignty and dignity. Black Women's Blueprint seeks collaborators yearning to engage, fashion, and embody interventions responsive to the profound effects of injustice, violence, and exploitation on women and all people, on nature, community, and our physical, psychological, and ecological well-being. First, I would like to welcome Savannah Brown. Savannah, co-executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, is recognized as a Miss Foundation Public Voices Fellow for her writing. Her work has been published in Ebony, Time Magazine, for Harriet, and Rewire News. She is also a birth worker and reproductive justice advocate, dedicating her work to the survival strategies that Black women build from rituals, sacred truths, and the way they honor the intergenerational narratives of their reproductive histories. At Black Women's Blueprint, she oversees advocacy campaigns, co-chairing the New York City for the Convention of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, addressing localized efforts to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. She has also provided training and technical assistance to a number of organizations through the Institute for Gender and Culture, including but not limited to Jackson State University, Florida Memorial University, Louisiana Foundation Against Sexual Assaults, and the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Assaults. Our second presenter, who I'm excited to introduce to you, is Farah Tanis. Farah Tanis is a transnational feminist and executive director of Black Women's Blueprint. She chaired the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the US, ever to focus on Black women and their historical and contemporary experiences with sexual assault and reproductive violations. She is also a Novo Foundation MEV, movement maker, and member of the US Human Rights Network Task Force on the International Human Rights Treaty, CERD, and the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and CAT, which is the UN Convention Against Torture. And again, so without any further delay, welcome Savannah and Farah. I am going to hand it over to both of you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction, and Jesse, really to both of you for the space you held and the space you're creating by inviting us to be with you all in this way today. My name is Savannah Brown, and as has already been stated, I'm the co-executive director at Black Women's Blueprint. And my co-executive director, Farah Tanis from Black Women's Blueprint, is here with us today. And we just want to thank CalCASA for the really radical and cutting edge conversations that get to happen and be held in this space. We really want to invite folks into an interactive process over the course of the next hour and 45 minutes, and for our second session, which will be held on Thursday. So welcome again to all to the Bystander Intervention mixtape to prevent systemic and intercommunal violence. We are looking at, over the course of the next 2 sessions, grounding our work in empathy and reconciliation and racial justice activism. And so we really hope that this will be an expanded conversation on bystander intervention, in addition to what you've already had, or if you're new to this conversation, that it will be transformative for you. So I'm really excited and looking forward to getting to know each of you more over the course of this afternoon and Thursday. You can go to the next slide, Sarah. While we love our bios and our introductions and all of those pieces of who we are and who we certainly are, we want to have the opportunity to get to know each other more deeply before we go into the conversation that we'll be going into. And so myself and Farah will invite you into a practice that we use. And we've adapted this practice of really creating an I am poem that gets to be a tapestry of who we are, all parts considered, not just the work that we do or our titles, but where we come from, and honoring a bearing witness of ourselves and a deeper practice. And so as Farah and I share, and I'll invite Farah to come off of mute in a few minutes, I invite each of you to either take a piece of paper or type on a Word document if you want to wordsmith a little bit. Eventually you will share it in the chat, but to be responsive to the 8 or 10 bullets that you see here around who you are, really. Who are you the descendants of? Digging into the senses, what are you the smell of? How would you describe your personality through sound or music? Where are you from? What do you hear? What do you understand? What do you dream? What do you believe? What do you try to do in your daily work and life? What are you curious about? What are the questions you're coming into this space with, and what questions you come into your life work with? And who are you? More your name, your pronouns, and your affiliation or the organization that you're with. So take just a moment to jot those down on paper or jot them in a separate tab or document. And as you're ready, to share them in the chat so that we can each learn on another level who is in the room and who's with us today virtually.
As you do that, Savannah and I will go ahead and introduce ourselves through the
Yes.
I am poem. So I'll start.
Sure.
I am the descendants of African people, of Haitian people. I am the descendant of Fritz Thomas Tanis and Marie Claude Joseph. I am the descendant of Esperanza Tanis, and I am the descendant of Teresa Telemay. I am the smell of hibiscus and cinnamon and aloe vera and cloves boiling on a pot in my grandmother's kitchen. I am the smell of sunny beaches. My personality, I'm the sound of drums beating all night. I am from Brooklyn, New York, although now I live in New Jersey. I am the sound of children laughing. I hear them, and that brings me joy. That gives me life. I understand that we are interconnected and that my ancestors walk with me every single day. I dream of a world where we begin to live the mantra that we cannot find wholeness, we cannot get to wholeness alone. I try to feed my spirit every chance I get through prayer and meditation. And what I'm curious about what kind of world we could create if failure was off the table, what kind of world we could create if we were to deploy our legacies of peace, of truth, of justice, of healing. I am Farah Tanis. I am co-executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Thank you for that power poem and model, Farah. I'll read mine, and I hope that folks who are on their way and finishing theirs will start to share in the chat so that we can hear more from those who are with us. I am the descendants of Mississippian and Kansas City women. I am the descendants of Joanne Herring and Barbara Jean and Annie Thaxton and Lizzie Moore. I am the descendant of midwives and card playing Baptist preaching women as well. I am the smell of baby oil from my mama's dresser that I used to go get. I'm also the smell of collard greens with turkey necks and black-eyed peas. I am the sound of Motown and jazz and Afro beats and Kojic music on Sunday morning. I'm from 9th Street in Genesee and also Williamson Road and Angel Drive. I hear my 3-year-old laughing and roaring at the same time. I understand that liberation and victory are on the way. I dream of a world that is free of violence and filled with joy. I believe that we are the ones we've been waiting for. I try to center spirit in everything that I do and be reminded of spirit always. I'm curious how we might build a collective alternative to current states of oppression. I am Savannah Brown. My pronouns are she, her, and sometimes mama. And I'm the co-executive director at Black Women's Blueprint.
What do we have in the chat, Savannah?
I'm seeing some poetry come through. I see Gabby Rodriguez. I am the descendants of Mexican parents and the smell of chili rellenos with the sound of Mexican trumpets, drums, and guitars. I love this. Great, Gabby, thank you.
Put it in the chat, y'all. Put it in the chat.
Definitely tell us, even if it's just a few of the lines that you came up with. You can answer in real time, doesn't have to be perfect.
That's right.
It is you, so we want to know who's here with us and how we can hold and honor who you are.
Who are you? Who are your people? Who are you a descendant of? Where are you from? Where did you live? Where do you live now? What do you call home? What do you smell when you're home, when you think of family? What do you hear? What do you dream of? What do you believe? What do you try to do every single day? What are you curious about? A lot of you have already put your names and your gender pronouns and your organizations, but keep sharing that. Let's come into the space. Let's get to know each other.
Alexia says, I am the descendants of Mexican people. I am
Mhm.
the smell of Lupe Partidas Carnitas.
Mm,
I'm from a small town in sunny California called Simi Valley.
mm,
I hear my nieces and nephews. I
mm.
believe in a world without borders. She,
Ah,
her,
love,
ella.
love it, love it. Mhm.
Thank you, Edwin. I am the descendant of Mexicans. Ashe.
Mhm.
It's okay. You can send more. No
That's
problem.
okay. Keep sending more. We'll keep circling back to this, but let's get through our, oh, here's,
I see them all coming in now.
yes, I'm the smell of hot soup, Kevin says. I'm the descendant of Laotian people. I'm the smell of hot soup and cold mornings. I dream of finding and creating peace in my surroundings. I try every day to practice self-compassion. I am Kevin, he, they pronouns. I am prevention educator with the Riverside Area Rape Crisis Center.
Hey,
Beautiful.
beautiful.
We'll take one more and then we'll move into our agenda.
I see Alejandra says, I had my niece sitting next to my 8-year-old. My
Mm,
8-year-old niece is sitting next to me and she answered, I am the descendant of Mechas,
mm,
Arturo, Maria, Grandma, Grandpa. I am the smell of Grandma's tamales. I
mm.
am curious about learning and science. Beautiful.
I see from Sarah, I am the descendant of Ukrainian farmers, Holocaust survivors, and Mexican immigrants. I am the smell of the ocean and redwoods, Bay Area fog. I'm tires screeching as they peel out of a parking lot. I'm from the Bay Area to Grass Valley. I hear wind, I hear rain. I understand that sexual violence is, ooh, let me scroll down. Sexual violence is, my scrolly. Savannah, can you see it?
Understand that.
Sexual violence is caused by oppression. I
Yes.
dream of a glass house. Yes. I believe that we can find solutions to violence that don't rely on more harm and
Yes.
oppression. I try to live my values every day. I'm curious how we find our way forward. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I
Thank
am
you.
the descendant, Liza. I hope I'm saying your name right. I am the descendant of Chicana, Latinx, resilient trans women of color. I am Liza. I hope I'm saying it. Liza Marie Ceballos. I am hoping I'm saying it right. Forgive me if I don't. From Trans Latina Coalition. Yes, welcome, welcome. I love it.
I'll read one more and then we can move
Ollie.
forward. They're just
Yeah.
irresistible. So I hope
Yes.
everyone's reading them. I'll read another out loud. I am the descendant of a large immigrant family from a small town in Mexico. I am the smell of chamomile tea with lemon and honey. I am the sound of wooden chimes in the wind. I'm from farmlands in Central California. I dream of peace, equity, and a healthy planet. Yes, Shay.
This is beautiful.
Wow, thank
These
you.
are irresistible. I'm
Aw,
looking
thank
at
you,
Chris
Chris. Thank you,
Bryant,
Bianca. Yes, thank you,
right?
Evan. Thank
Descendant
you.
of Black parents, the smell of jasmine flowers and cold winter night, the sound of jazz piano. For I am the 412th and J. You're from 12th and J. You hear, I hear my highest power constantly guiding me. I understand that only love can drive out hate. Yes, I dream of green pastures of mountaintops. I believe we can overcome everything. I try to always learn more. I am curious about life. I am Chris Bryant and my pronouns are he, him, his. All right, last one. That's it.
Amazing. I mean, thank you
Love
so
it,
much
love
for
it.
bringing yourselves into the room, for sharing. I mean, we're on Zoom all day long, every day. So having the opportunity to bear witness to each other in this way is powerful. So thank you. If something else comes to you or you want to share and you didn't get to upload your poem, please do so while we're together.
Yeah, we're gonna move quickly through these next slides because
yes,
the organization was already introduced, so we'll move quickly so we can cover
yes,
everything that we have in store for
yes,
you today.
absolutely. So you can go to the next slide. And just briefly, Black Women's Blueprint, again, is a feminist organization using civil and human rights approaches to the work that we do. We are national, so we're all over the country, and we also have global roots. If you can go to the slide before that talks about collective practices, we just want to build on the shared agreements and the principles of struggle that we've adapted from Natanya Lee, from Left Roots, that really say the following: we are living beings creating living work. The invitation, it really is to come here and bring solutions and suggestions. So we hope the chat will be active. Assume good intent and attend to impact. We're in a virtual space, so we can keep caring for each other and taking care of one another. Engage in tension, but don't indulge in trauma. If something comes up that you don't agree with, let's talk about it, let's move through it. We are creating a new world while we're also immersed in this realm of intersecting oppressions. So we're struggling for the sake of deepening our unity together and collective understanding. We will hold confidentiality and preserve the sacred space in this work, and cite the work if you want to take it outside of this space, and actively work against silos. We can go to the next slide just to talk about an overview of the two sessions, the two webinar sessions that we're in. Today is session 1, part 1 of the training. So this training will address, the training that we're in now will address utilizing an anti-oppression framework that explores the intersections between sexual violence prevention and racial justice activism. On Thursday, when you're all back for session 2, and maybe others will join us, that session will also be highly interactive, and we will be training based on a very heavy emphasis on skill building for community safety, and also grounding our work in the bystander intervention that looks both at empathy and reconciliation. So we'll have an opportunity to look more closely at that. On the next slide, Sarah, we're looking at the objectives, right, for today's session. So in part 1, we'll really look to list strategies or actions that shift the culture around codes of loyalty and protection of the community, so that these codes also include loyalty to Black women, girls, and others who may be targets of sexual violence. We'll also identify existing barriers to traditional bystander intervention and techniques to overcome these barriers. Then we'll demonstrate the ability to utilize culturally specific active bystander intervention strategies that disrupt our current problematic social norms and engage communities in the work to prevent sexual violence. So that's what we'll be working on today. I think we can jump right in. We'll go through some definitions, some terms, and then we'll even circle back to revisit those terms. But the first thing is to really just break the ice around what bystander intervention is, right? We hear this term a lot. It's very relevant to our work. And the clear-cut definition around what's bystander intervention is choosing to take action when you see behavior or another action that puts others at risk for violence, victimization, or perpetration. This includes, in bystander intervention, we're talking about speaking out or acting out against rape myths and sexist language, supporting victims and survivors, or intervening in potentially violent situations. So intervening in order to prevent more violence from occurring. So that's the term that we have and the term that we've been using as a field, and the definition that we've been using as a field. More deeply, on the next slide, and just as important and especially central to this training, is a definition of anti-oppression. And we'll get into that a little bit more deeply, but just for our definition of it, anti-oppression is a commitment to social equality and social justice that we seek to identify and also eliminate our individual and our systemic barriers, the barriers that we have towards freedom, towards liberation, and towards equity. We really have to contextualize or recontextualize that bystander intervention definition that we have and place it within the context of anti-oppression. So that means going beyond stopping harm from just an individual against another, and stopping harm by a system against an individual or against a family or against a community. So anti-oppression definition actually allows us to broaden our stance. In the next slide, we're going to take you into a conversation that's really about how do we bring bystander intervention to an anti-oppressive lens. Bystander intervention through an anti-oppression lens is really about responding to both intracommunal and intercommunal violence. So we want to unpack the distinctions between intracommunal and intercommunal violence and do those simultaneously. So that's at a micro and macro level, and also in the private and public spheres. So we want to ask and to have you chat a few examples or ideas or current events where you can think of what are some of the ways in which harm is done at an intracommunal level. So looking at that as one category, and then at an intercommunal level. So if you can just chat, oh, intracommunal would be X, Y, and Z, maybe an example. And then intercommunal level, from your understanding. You can get a couple examples in the chat. What are some of the ways violence or harm is done at an intracommunal level and then at an intercommunal level? Any thoughts, ideas from anywhere? Anyone is good. Farah says intracommunal would be violence inside of our homes. Yes, that's right. Others have ideas about what intercommunal would look like just with that in mind. Intercommunal is violence within our community. So it's actually violence that comes from outside of the community into the community. That's intercommunal. Internalized trauma at intracommunal level, dehumanizing others on intercommunal level. It's a great context for that. Intracommunal would be internalized forms of oppression. Again, another affirmation of that. Farah also names intercommunal could include hate crimes and attacks that are racially motivated. Could intracommunal be on a neighborhood level? Would that be inter? Great question. So these are really good examples. And Sarah, if you'll take us to the next slide, we can unpack more definitively what the distinctions between intracommunal and intercommunal are. So when we're talking about intracommunal, and just like we're seeing in the chat, you all are right on point. Intracommunal is when harm is done within a community. So by one community member to another. That includes intimate partner violence within the home, sexual violence in one's own community, or a community where they identify like or shared identities, or shared experiences even. Family violence is another example of intracommunal. I love that folks are making the distinction also around internalized issues of trauma and internalized violence, internalized assumptions about identity. Violence inside of communities like places of worship, sometimes movement spaces, also campuses we think of. That could be intracommunal, even though intercommunal violence can happen there if it's a cross difference. So when we're looking at intercommunal, we're talking about violence that's across difference, whether it be race or gender, sexuality, it could be age as well. Police violence is an example of intercommunal violence. And when someone outside of your community commits violence against you or your community at large. So those are the distinctions that we're making. And the reason that we want to make these distinctions is because we're going to go into some examples and offer some questions where we'll be able to discuss in breakout groups, what are the differences in how bystander intervention gets applied when it's intracommunal harm and when it's intercommunal harm. We can move on to the next slide that allows us to just ask some questions and continue this conversation around how is it that how do we transform the practice of bystander intervention from one which focuses on preventing harm to the individual to one that focuses on preventing harm to whole communities? How do we look more broadly at bystander intervention as an approach? The second question is, can we deploy strategies and systems change that actively result in sustainable action to dismantle patriarchy and racism simultaneously? And we'll talk more about why we're pairing those. And that would allow us to take this beyond the one-on-one interventions on behalf of targets. Can we deploy strategies and systems change that would allow us to broaden that? Using an anti-oppression framework also means we flip the script on our common understanding of bystander intervention. So we look beyond just the individual interactions of violence and harm, and we start to see how is this impacting the entire community, and how can the whole community actually be enrolled in a form of intervention that's more radicalized than the approaches that we've been using. In the next slide, we have an opportunity also to contextualize this greater in the current moment. So the urgency of now, right? As we think about the moment that we're in, the political conversation that we're in, and the communal conversation that we're in, we have the context of the Breathe Act and the Defund movement, which has a lot of us asking questions and determining what community safety will look like. And during this really crucial political transitional moment in our nation also, we really have to go beyond the paradigm of intervening on behalf of the individual and now start to think about how do we recommit collectively to an anti-oppression lens? How do we recommit collectively to ending harm against whole communities? And how do we include and also center women and girls in those communities? And we're thinking also particularly in this example around Black, Indigenous, and women and girls of color. And so one story that really illuminates the necessity of us not just centering it in this now, right? But also centering it in the urgency that we have at hand as we think about what community safety looks like. And so the story that we wanted to talk about, or the example that we wanted to highlight, is really the 19-year-old Black Lives Matter activist from Florida, Oluwatoyin Salau, who this summer was found dead 1 week after she went missing, directly after a Black Lives Matter protest, which was during the racial uprisings, during the violence that ensued around the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor last spring. And Oluwatoyin, just days before she went missing, had been tweeting about her experiences of sexual violence, her experience of being a survivor. And she did all of that in the context, she shared all of that in the context also of her work as a freedom fighter, really as someone who was on the front line of justice. And so there were videos that were circulated of her speaking at protests around George Floyd, around Tony McDade. We learned later that she was homeless during the times of the protest. And so she was relying on community churches and community housing and support. She went by a nearby church to seek shelter and clothing and food and transportation and other basic needs that she had following the protest, where she had been really public and speaking. And she was picked up by who would be unfortunately, her rapist and murderer, who kidnapped her, offered her a ride. He said, "Where are you going? What do you need? What's happening?" Offered her a ride. And she was kidnapped, held hostage. She was raped repeatedly. And then she was found dead. And in this story, as devastating, right, as this story presents to us, there are these matrices, right, of oppression that are happening, all the while that this young activist from Florida is responding to, right? She's responding to the murders of Black men. She's responding to the murders of Black trans men. She's responding to racial violence and racial injustice. And in this circumstance, we are not finding a march for Oluwatoyin Salau, right? And could barely, as Black Women's Blueprint as an organization, galvanize 100 people around her story, around the intersectionality of patriarchy and violence and white supremacist violence at that. And so holding her story and really lifting up this young person who would fight for justice on behalf of her entire race, right? And on behalf of her community, also in the midst of that faces intracommunal violence, right? Her perpetrator, her murderer, her harm doer, the person who kidnapped her was in fact a Black man, right? And she is responding to white supremacist violence. She's responding to intercommunal violence. And in the midst of that, intracommunal violence happens. And so it's not about the terminology, it's not about the language, it's about the circumstances and the conditions that led to her murder and that led to the lack of protection around hundreds of Black women every year, even in the midst of movement organizing and where we're moving the needle on other priorities within the racial justice movement, it's often at the backs and on the cost of Black women and girls. So that connection, right, has to inform our bystander intervention and anti-oppressive lens. We have to talk about it while we're looking at the Breathe Act, while we're looking at the defund movement, while we're talking about defining community safety and transforming community safety as a way to build power and create self-determination within the community. We can't sleep on her story, right? It's present with us. And so we really wanted to take the opportunity to allow that story to illuminate for us the complexities of how this gets to define what we mean by bystander intervention. How do we move forward in a praxis of bystander intervention when we have to think about the layers and these matrices of oppression that are impacting Black women and girls specifically, right? They're not without consequence. And so I really want to just pause here. And this is where we really have the opportunity to go into discussion and to think deeply about what our definitions have been, where they've been landing with us, have they been working, have they not been working, and to unpack this story with more depth. And here I also want to invite us, because for many, we know this story, for many, we don't know this story, or we haven't thought about it in this context, to give ourselves the opportunity to check in emotionally, right? Where is this story landing with us? Where are the questions in the context of this conversation landing with us? What is it that we need to, one, take care of ourselves in the midst of unpacking this? And two, to think strategically and more expansively about how it is that we navigate this as a community and how we navigate this as activists, because it's our role, right? It's our role. So here, I would just invite a pause, and we're going to be moving into some breakout groups and discussion. So Sarah, if you could bring the questions up that we want to invite all to be in, that would just give us just about 10 minutes to think through where an anti-oppression framework to explore these intersections between sexual violence prevention and racial justice activism, where they come into play using the story. How do we respond when it is the community versus when it's the police? In a Luatoin story, it's actually both. How we engage when it is white supremacist violence versus when it's intra-community violence. What's the response? What's the general response and reaction? And what are the approaches to harm and violence when it is coming from the outside versus the inside? And thinking broadly about those distinctions of outside versus inside. So the idea here is that we'll move into groups of 4, and each group will take one of the questions, right? So group 1 will have the first, 2 the second, and so on and so forth. And give folks an opportunity to meet and greet and be in community with one another, and really take time to deepen and unpack. So with Sarah and Jesse's support, we'll break out. If there aren't any questions, we'll time it around 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to have an opportunity to share in the bigger room. Perhaps we can, maybe Sarah, you're already doing this, but put the questions in the chat so that
So your breakout rooms are open. Folks should be getting the notification to join now, but please feel free to send me a message if you have any issues joining, and we are working on getting those questions in the chat for you all.
Can I help you with getting the questions in the chat, or are you good?
I think I'm good. I just got them in the chat. I can also broadcast a message to everyone.
Okay. I'm not really sure how to assign one question to folks. I don't think we.
So I'm gonna do broadcast a message for group 1 and then group 2.
Oh, good. Okay. There's a lot of groups. I wish I could help you with this somehow, but I can't.
Wait. There are, okay, 13.
There are probably 10 groups, 11.
There's 13. That's 13 divided by 4.
But they don't, do they know which room they're in?
I think so. Otherwise it's.
What if you did just, yeah. Tell them room 1, 4, and this. Do this one. Oh, there you go. You are so smart. That is way better than what I was thinking.
Economic, social, political, psychological, religious, ideological, and legal systems of inequality, privilege, and power based on skin color. Racism, the systematic, generational, unequal distribution of power and access, and the privileging of one group over another. For example, in the US, the privileging of white people over Black, Indigenous people of color, a form, sign of racism. And then extending to white supremacy, we use that term often, the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. And patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system of relationships, beliefs, and values embedded in current political, social, and economic systems that structure gender inequality between men and women and other genders. Patriarchal relations structure both the private and public spheres, ensuring that men dominate both. Patriarchy also complicates our definitions of race, racism, and white supremacy, because there can be patriarchy within more marginalized groups. So Black patriarchy, for example, exists and impacts that intracommunal violence. In the same way that there was a march for Oluwatoyin, but there was not a march for Oluwatoyin, but there was a march for George Floyd, and in other circumstances where patriarchy gets superimposed and overlays with race and racism. We'll also use intersectionality. You've already heard us say intersectionality, and that's an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine, again, that matrix of oppression or the matrix of assets in that person's identity, and creates different modes of discrimination and or privilege, as they can be both held at once. Examples of these aspects are gender, caste, sex, race, class, sexuality, religion, disability, physical appearance, and height. Those are just some. And then the definition of oppression that we use are unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power, especially by the imposition of burdens, the condition of being weighed down, an act of pressing down, a sense of heaviness or obstruction in the body, mind, or an entire community. Moreover, oppression often discussed in the same context of the terms dehumanization or exploitation. So often when bystander intervention is used, oppression is being acted out or being made public.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Savannah. So we want to move into a whole new layer. Now that we've reviewed the terms, now that we've looked at some of the terms that we've been seeing, that we've been talking about, that have been at the forefront of our minds, not only in our circles, but also when you think of what's happening on social media and the media. Let's move into what it means to act against oppression, right? To reframe bystander intervention as action against oppression, and to reframe it as a practice that is really not new. It is not difficult to make that leap. Some of us are already making it. We just need to be conscious of it. So I would invite you to think right now, please, of ways in which people in your community, the people you have chosen to be your community, your family, the people from whom you came, right? Your people. So when we say who are your people are the smell of, you are the smell of, you are the sound of, I am the descendant of. Think of how long of a legacy we all have had in intervening on behalf of each other wherever we come from. Think of that legacy wherever you come from. In communities of African descendants living here in the United States, or African American people, Black people, we have a legacy of anti-oppression action. So if you are, from descendants of Native American or Indigenous people, if you are descendants of Mexican people, if you're a descendant of, folks from other Caribbean nations, or from African nations, or from the Ukraine, or of a person, if you're a person of even Jewish descent, right? Think about what your people have done to mobilize, not only in private, but in public, to mobilize and take action as a whole different level of bystander, as moral rebels, as folks with moral courage to fight against oppression. What is that legacy? We have a legacy of fighting oppression. We have a legacy of not just being bystanders, but being these critical, radical responders when oppression shows up, whether it is against one person or against our entire group of people, right? So during the civil rights movement, our ancestors suffered consequences for making sure we had equal rights. So regardless of the consequences, we made sure, think of those moments, think of those ancestors, think of those generations just before you, and think of the generation right here that we are part of, right? That we are constantly fighting, we are constantly engaged in bystander intervention. It is accessible. It is something that can be done on various levels. So we, as people of African descent, have fought for equal access to public facilities, equal opportunity in employment, housing, education, as well as the right to vote. And we continue to do so. We fight against violence. We fight against a number of oppressions, and we do it publicly, and we do it using the steps of bystander intervention and beyond, which we will address later on in this training. And so on the next slide, when we think about the civil rights movement, and when you think about the movements that came out of your communities, when you think about the movements in which your families have been involved, in which you have been involved, think about the actions, the specific steps that were taken, and what it took to get folks to act, to get folks to intervene, sometimes at great costs, sometimes at threats to their own lives, right? So when we talk about the civil rights movement and this legacy, it was led by people like you. When you think about your legacy of intervention, of bystander intervention, of being a moral rebel, these movements, these actions, these interventions were led by people like you. And these actions fundamentally change the lives of the people in your community. And for the civil rights movement, for example, which we're naming here, the day after, what was yesterday? MLK Day, right? This changed America, right? It forced the federal government to do its job and protect the rights of American citizens. Advocates, students, regular people like you, like me, came in community and saw injustice, and they intervened. Because they intervened, they changed the landscape, not just for one, but for all. So we're going to use an example, and this is going to sort of tie together Oluwatoyin's story, but let's look at one of the anti-rape mobilizations and campaigns that occurred in 1944. So the case of Reese Taylor. Some of you know Reese, some of you don't know Reese. But Reese Taylor in 1944, 24 years old, she was a 24-year-old mom. She had a daughter. She's the daughter of sharecroppers. Reese Taylor was strolling home with her friend Fanny and her nephew Daniel. They were coming home from church. It was an evening of singing and praying at the Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, Alabama. 7 white men pulled up alongside them, among them Herbert Lovett, in whose home Reese was a domestic worker. The other men, Dillard York, Billy Howerton, Luther Lee, Joe Culpepper, Robert Gamble, they were armed with knives and shotguns, and they ordered Reese into a green Chevrolet. They then raped her and left her for dead. In looking at the case of Reese Taylor, there was outrage. Let's think about the outrage that it prompted. For those of you who know Reese Taylor, who've read At the Dark End of the Street or have seen The Rape of Reese on Netflix, her story is being told. Her story has been told. Her story was told to us at Black Women's Blueprint, as she was one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Black Women and Sexual Violence. When you look at the case of Reese Taylor, the outrage that it prompted, the 7 men who kidnapped and forced Reese Taylor into their car at gunpoint and drove her away and sexually assaulted her and tried and threatened to kill her. When you think about the fact that they were only ordered to pay $250, one of them was ordered to pay. The police did not do anything, as is very common in cases where BIPOC women and trans folks and other folks are sexually assaulted, where there's an incident. And although these men confessed, although the town knew in Abbeville what had happened, all of these events, all of these points, the fact that Wilson admitted the role, no one was charged, sparked protests back in 1944. In further analyzing the case, Reese's family mobilized. When we spoke with Reese and her brother, she says that my father stood up in the tree, this great big old great tree that overlooked the house, because he wanted to protect me in the event that these men came back. Remember, the man who organized the rape against Reese Taylor was someone in whose home she worked. And so he knew where she lived. These were not strangers, right? As is usually the case in cases of sexual assault. They mobilized, they spoke about it. They provided Reese with support. They believed Reese when Reese said, I was sexually assaulted. The community was outraged. They reported the sexual assault to the police. They reported the sexual assault to the Montgomery NAACP. They sent Rosa Parks in. As a result, Rosa Parks created what then became called the Equal Justice for Mrs. Back then it was Mrs. Reese Taylor, right? So the local president of the NAACP branch assigned Rosa Parks to investigate this sexual assault, naming it a sexual assault, naming it a rape. And then Rosa Parks, in taking this case on, launched a movement that ultimately changed the world and changed the Black community and changed the Black feminist movement and the Black anti-rape movement as it exists today. And so when you think about the case of Reese Taylor, think about who was included, who stood up for Reese Taylor, who was raped by 7 white men in Abbeville, Alabama. The stars, right? What we would call the celebrities of the day: W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, County Cullen, Langston Hughes were involved. right? This was a primary instance of nationwide protests because Recy Taylor's assailants were never charged. Eventually, in 2011, the Alabama House of Representatives apologized on behalf of the state of Alabama for their failure to get justice and to do justice in the case of Recy Taylor. She was already a senior citizen. She was already an elder, but it wasn't until then that the case of Recy Taylor was made public, and also with the writing of the book by Danielle McGuire, that the case was made public. And so that mobilization that happened was organized by Rosa Parks and by the celebrities of that day. And so just think about, the case of Recy Taylor, and think about whether or not, first I want to ask, right? Let's go to the chat. Just please chat. Have you ever heard before this session, had you ever heard of the case of Recy Taylor or heard of this story? I can't see much. Yes. Okay, great.
Before that, there were quite a few no's. So lots
No.
of no, never heard, haven't heard. Then there's some yes, have seen the documentary.
When Recy Taylor passed in 2016, was it, Savannah? 2016, 2017, she passed a few days before her birthday. Oprah Winfrey said Recy Taylor's name. And we were like, yes, say her name. Finally say her name. Because we had been reaching out about Recy Taylor and that narrative in our work to do anti-rape and to create and to mobilize people against sexual assault and other forms of gender violence. So who were the active bystanders? When you think of Recy Taylor's story, who were the active bystanders? Her father, her brother, the community, the NAACP, Rosa Parks, her church. Everyone is capable. Everyone is capable. What anti-oppression strategies were deployed? They're organizing, they're letter writing, they're speaking out, they're lending their names to the movement, to the action, their advocacy. They're organizing community, forming a committee, forming an organization. The naming sexual violence, the denouncing sexual violence, the defense of Recy Taylor. What are the implications of this scenario as it relates to racism, sexism, and sexual assault? When you think of the Recy Taylor sexual assault, the violence that occurred, can you name one case in history that we know of where a Black woman in this day and age was sexually assaulted and that the community mobilized on her behalf in that way? There may be one or two. But the issue of racism complicates our response to sexual violence. And we'll talk later about how race is constantly pitted against gender and gender identity, and how we are forced, even as a community, not just as survivors, as a community, to choose. So it is easier to mobilize for Recy Taylor because it was 7 white men. But how do we practice accountability in our communities? How do we practice accountability, or as Aisha Shahida Simmons says it, love with accountability? How do we engage in processes of transformative and restorative justice? Those two are in the long game, right? Those two are broader strategies, if you want to call it, within bystander intervention. It is taking action to prevent a harm before it occurs or to prevent a harm from occurring again. Regardless of who commits the harm. This is not a popular stance, family. It's not a popular stance that we are taking, but we keep discussing it because especially in the age of COVID, especially as we know as advocates, that survivors are experiencing atrocities within their own homes as they shelter in place. It is important that we have this conversation as we are watching white supremacists, violence, and as we are protesting, rightfully so, and we'd better, across any race, protest white supremacist violence as it is choking the breath out of us. Let us also address violence inside of our communities, not just as advocates, but let us prepare our communities to do so as well as we look at defunding, as we look at defunding police, as we look at the Breathe Act. And I know many of us are having, there's conversation to be had around that. What will our role be? We will need to wake up even more than we are awake right now. So on the next slide, why is it important to discuss challenges on acting on behalf of Black women? And I want to say not just on behalf of Black women, but on behalf of all individuals inside of the community who are not the quintessential victims of oppression, of racist oppression, right? So when you think about that, stark differences exist between the mobilization on behalf of Reese and Oluwatoyin. What were those stark differences? Inherent in the question, mobilization. There was no mobilization on behalf of Oluwatoyin. And in your breakout groups, I'm sure some of you discussed why you think that is. Who is the harm doer? How do we confront harm no matter where it pops up? How do we denounce harm no matter where it pops up and at the intersection, and while not separating racism from gender discrimination and sexism and transphobia? So there are stark differences there where an entire community came to surround Reese Taylor, as they should have. And so how do we continue in that legacy? How do we continue in the practice of interrupting violence and being not just active bystanders, but people who practice moral courage, who are moral rebels that despite, and one of the things that was said in my group is there's a lot of fear around intervening, especially when it's intra-community violence, right? But we must do this. It is important. Our survival depends on it. When COVID is over, not if, when COVID is over, we will have to take stock and we will have to count how many of people from inside our communities were dying inside at the hand of another. We'll have to count. And so it is critical now more than ever. Our communities are being remade. This nation is being remade. We as advocates must be a part of that remaking, and we must speak and say what it is we want to see as active, not passive bystanders. And so the strategies or any action that shift the culture around codes of loyalty and protection has to center Black women, femmes, LGBTQ folks targeted for sexual violence and racist violence. And so what are these strategies? What are strategies that we've already enacted, that we've already been involved with, that we've already deployed and even founded when we think of the three sisters who founded Black Lives Matter, right? These are three sisters, three queer Black feminists. They say in their own words, when we founded Black Lives Matter, it was for everyone. That was their form of bystander intervention. That was to say, bystander intervention must be undergirded by a broader ideology that centers human rights and civil rights and dignity and sovereignty for every single person in our communities. That's what bystander intervention should rest upon, right? So when you think about the strategies we put into place, from individual interventions, from the creation of ideology that should support the way in which we move and show up as bystanders, as active bystanders, think about the Black women's leadership as a strategy as well that has shifted this culture. How are we creating this loyalty, this sense of community, this sense of I see you, regardless of your gender identity, regardless of your ability? I see you with your ability, with your gender identity, and I am with you, and it is not your fault, and I will mobilize on your behalf, and I will interrupt violence against you, and I will speak against violence against you as an active bystander. So we create, Black women have been in leadership in doing that, in Black Lives Matter, in Me Too. Kamala Harris is about to take office as a VP. We have been amplifying racist violence against Breonna Taylor. We've been amplifying racist, sexist violence against Sandra Bland. We've denounced police rapes against Black women in Oklahoma. When you think of the Holtzclaw case with the white police officer who was convicted of sexually assaulting women of color that he would pull over and that he would interact with. What other strategies are we doing to shift culture so that bystander intervention can become radical response? We've engaged in denouncing police rapes against Black women, as I just said. We have engaged in the campaign to mute R. Kelly, to denounce sexual violence, kidnapping, and trafficking against Black women. All of these are interventions. They are bystander responses. They are active bystander intervention. Denouncing Bill Cosby despite his standing in the Black community. Exposing Russell Simmons and the industries that perpetuate violence against Black women with the movie On the Record. Theater productions, we've done that. We've done marches, we've done rallies. We've done several things as a community, not just as Black Women's Blueprint. We've also organized marches in partnership with organizations like Trans Sisters of Color Project Detroit, the Black Youth Project in Chicago, Sister Song. We've worked across sectors to do the work. And so so name and think about the ways in which you yourself, whether independently, inside or outside of organizations, that you have engaged in intervention and you continue to do so in the midst of oppression. Think of the Black trans identified people who marched this summer, who organized one of the biggest marches of the summer, demanding justice for Black trans people murdered, sexually assaulted in our communities. So when we think of these modern day scenarios, next slide, I'm sorry. When we think of these modern day scenarios, it to us is a victory that we were able to march for Breonna Taylor at the same time that we marched for George Floyd. The next slide, please. As we march for George Floyd. I know we're behind a little bit, y'all. I should say next slide. And I'm at what are modern day scenarios? Next slide. As we march for George Floyd. So even with the swell of protests surrounding George Floyd, Breonna Taylor was not forgotten. Whereas before, we had to demand that Black women not be left behind. This is a culture shift. This means things are changing. It's a victory that Breonna Taylor was not forgotten and that we kept talking about Breonna Taylor, that people are thinking about what our responsibilities are. People are shifting and saying we must be loyal to everyone. We have a responsibility towards every single person in our community. Next slide, please. So unpacking the challenges. Our work is not done. What are the challenges? Next slide, please. So in this next slide, we're going to take about 60 seconds, I think it is, right? And we're going to listen to an individual narrative about bystander intervention. And then we're going to take you into sort of what is really the last phase of this conversation here in session 1. There's an audio. There's an audio. Savannah?
I got it.
Yeah, there is an audio. I
Okay,
think
great.
Sarah has it.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Sorry, give me 1 sec. It's not playing for some reason, even though I tested it earlier and it played just fine. Sorry for the
Don't worry,
delay, y'all. It's thinking.
At first, I wasn't sure if it was deliberate or not, particularly as there were other people around me. I wondered perhaps if he was new to London and hadn't got as much awareness of personal space, and it was uncomfortable. And so I deliberately stood up and I moved towards the vestibule area. As I was standing there, I could see in the reflection that there was somebody else behind me. It hadn't occurred to me it could be him, but I became aware of a distinct sensation against my skirt. And I realized in horror that what I was feeling was his erect crotch area rubbing against my behind. I couldn't quite believe what was happening, to be honest. I think, like many women, I doubted that it could really be this. And partly because of this and partly to avoid him, I took a very deliberate step to the right. At this point, he followed me and repeated it. And so there was no doubt in my mind of what he was doing. I'm pleased to say that I managed to summon the courage to confront him. I think partly because there were some other commuters around me, and also partly because I could see that there was a CCTV camera. And so I asked him very loudly, in a state of shock, as you can imagine, what are you doing? At this point, the DLR actually pulled into my station. To my shock, the man barely flinched. He just very casually stepped off the DLR and boarded the next carriage. I also got off the DLR at this point as well, and stood on the platform trying to come to terms with what had happened. But I did remember that I'd seen a campaign, believed it was run by the BTP and TfL, around encouraging people to come forward and report events like this. On the basis of this campaign, and also on the basis that I was convinced that he would repeat the offence, I reported the offence within minutes of leaving the DLR. And I spoke to a very helpful and very supportive officer who took me through what would happen next. I told her what had happened. She believed me, which was the important thing. And I have to say that's actually been a very significant part in me moving on from this event, because I was believed the whole way through. I'm very pleased to say that they did catch the offender.
We can stop it here. I think this is the wrong audio. It's okay. So this one was not the particular audio that we wanted you to hear, but I can still walk you through Lauren's story, right? So Lauren boarded the train, and this was another man who was standing behind her. And he kept whispering in her ear, baby this, baby that, and was really whispering profanities. So she stood up and he stood up and walked, she sat down. And so the man came and stood in front of her. She stood up again, went and held the train. For those of you who are in New York, or you might call it the Metro in DC, and held the bars. There was another person, a man, who saw that she was very uncomfortable and who noticed this man sort of like looming and just standing over her while she stood up again, and he was behind her and very up close against her. She says she froze, right? And so the man decided that he was going to intervene as a bystander, having witnessed this situation. So what he does is he calls her, he says, hey, Lauren, are you going over? And this is not her real name. He says, Lauren, are you heading over to Pete's party? You know, and she looks at him sort of disoriented, like, what's going on? Who is this man? Should I trust him? What's up? And she says, then she realizes by looking at him that this man is trying to intervene. And so she responds immediately, yes, I am going. And he says, oh yeah, maybe we can walk over together. Then he says, what stop are you getting off on? And so she tells him what stop she's getting off on. So he then hands her the phone and says, this is the address I got. Do you have the same address? And what he did, he had used the notes app on his phone, and he had scribbled down, are you okay? So she takes his phone and she's like, yeah, that's the one, but you're missing a couple of something. She whispers and says, no, I am not. I'm very afraid. And so what he does is he's like, oh, okay, great. So let's walk together. He moves over, he stands next to her, and they exit the train together. They exit the metro together. So that's the story. My apologies. The other story is all, it's a little bit different, but this is the story. This is the testimony that Lauren gave. And then she goes and she thinks this bystander, this active bystander, his name is Michael, and says, thank you so much for seeing that I was in distress, for noticing the event, for knowing how to intervene, and for intervening, right? And so in the next slide, right? Oh, I'm sorry, not yet the next slide. One of the things that we want to ask, in the next slide, we want you to think about is what would you have done? B, what are the steps in bystander intervention that Michael took in this situation? And then, of course, let's go to the next slide. So what would it have taken? How much of a leap would it have been for Michael to go from being a bystander or an active bystander to becoming a moral rebel or radical responder? What does it take to move from that position of bystander to radical responder? So we know that Michael did what? Michael noticed the event. Michael knew how to help. Michael then intervened, right? He took very, very quick steps here. So what do you think other strategies could have been? What other strategies could Michael have used to ensure that the harm doer doesn't just move to another potential victim? Yes, he and Lauren walked out of the train station. She thanked him. The harm doer was gone for now. In relationship to Lauren, the harm doer moved on. But what other strategies could Michael have used to ensure that the harm doer doesn't just move on to another potential victim? And then how could the whole train car or the metro car have been enrolled to become responders so that there is a community response beyond the train? You could put it in the chat. What other strategies could he have used? It's right on the screen, so that the harm doer doesn't move to another potential victim.
There's a number of responses in the chat. Someone said, report the harm doer from Vanessa. Kathleen also noted, depending on safety level, confronting the harm doer would be a good idea because he will move on. Elisa says, take in a video or picture of the man to gather evidence for charges. Kathleen was clarifying he would move on to someone else. Take a video, Edwin affirms. Maybe gotten him kicked off the train. He could have confronted the harm doer and held them to report.
That's right.
Make an audible big deal of what was witnessed. Loudly exclaim, wow, are you seeing this guy? So enrolling other people on the train. Take a video or a picture, again, confronting the harm doer directly, helping Lauren report, and calling in other passengers on the train.
Yes, these are all excellent. That is correct. And for those of you who are still thinking, please problematize it. Like if there is, there's the issue of fear, if there's the issue of, what is it also that would Michael have to confront? So that is always a question. We will cover that in tomorrow, not tomorrow, day after tomorrow's session. Yes, Mobilize other bystanders. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Right?
Yeah.
There was a moment there to do all of that, to do all of this, and to cause a ripple effect, right? What is the signal that goes out when somebody said, audibly make a sound? Tell people, can you believe this? Look what's happening here. Call attention to it. Send out the signal. How are we causing a ripple effect so that bystander intervention becomes this radical response, or a response that goes beyond, yes, Lauren is safe for now, as we know. Lauren is safe. And then how do we make sure that we keep others safe? So these are all just amazing, amazing responses. So in the next slide, when we think about the action continuum, you've already started to list them, right? So in the action continuum, it takes you from, when a harm occurs, what do we do? What are the options? What are the choices that many people make? What are the choices? They actively participate. From actively participating, which is that complicity or that harm doing, that joining the harm doer component that we talked about before, denying or ignoring, which is also complicity, right? Staying silent, denying it, recognizing it and taking no action, which is also complicity, recognizing it and then taking action, which is what Michael did. Educating oneself or educating others, that is another step that could have been taken. Supporting and encouraging, enrolling other bystanders. Yes, that could have been an action. And then of course, there is the initiating and preventing, which is continuous. And there are different ways to do that. There are ways to build upon that in terms of initiating and preventing as far as the action continuum. So we encourage you to not be inside the box when we think of the action continuum. Actions can go on and on, right? And how much better and how much stronger can our community be if we took more action and we expanded these actions, not only to the individual, but enrolling the whole car, educating ourselves, speaking out against sexual assault right there in that moment, speaking out against harassment right there in that moment. So, which is what we're talking about. So in the next slide, when we think about the action continuum, when we think about the struggles that we are engaged in as racial justice movements, as gender justice movements, when we think about these things, these are some of the questions I'd like to pose. And again, these are questions because these are sort of conversations that we need to begin having. Many of you already having them. But it is critical now more than ever. So with the most recent introduction of the Breathe Act, right? And the defund movement, how do we become moral rebels and radical responders when the police and calling the police, it's not an option? What is our role? And I encourage you to see yourself outside of your organization. Our organizations do not dictate whether or not we become active bystanders. Whether or not we are job or jobless, we can be active bystanders, right? And so it is not in relationship, it is a choice that we have to make to take action, to educate ourselves, to mobilize others, right? To develop and strengthen and nurture and flex that moral courage muscle and become these responders that are not just responders, but we're radical in our response in the sense that now this happened, we're gonna educate community. What do we do when white supremacist violence targets people in our communities through the police? What do we do? When we think about the fact that for Black women, there can be no racial justice without gender justice. And I know it seems inverted to say that, but we say for Black women, because of the exploitation of our bodies, because of the gendered forms of racism that we experience, that for us, our race is intertwined with our gender. It always has been, from the slave ship to the plantation, through Jim Crow, as you saw with Recy Taylor, and even today. Race, gender are intertwined. gender identity are intertwined, class are intertwined. And so what do we do when white supremacist violence spills onto the streets or the halls of the US Capitol? What do we do? What is our role? How do we begin to think more broadly? How do we begin to wake ourselves up so that we can address the bigger conditions, the bigger problems that we are facing in our communities, the fear tactics that we are confronting, the anxiety that many of us are feeling now, even now in our bodies, as we know what tomorrow is, right? As most people are engaging in nation building or rebuilding at this very moment, as we are confronting white supremacist violence all around us, as we are confronting gender violence right around us, we're on the cusp of a transformation. And we as activists who have joined this session, we can be part of that. Nothing is impossible. Think of what you said at the beginning, at the opening of the session, when you said, I believe that, I dream of, I am curious about. So what is our response as our movements face these crises and work to confront men's violence against women and gender violence as a whole, right? And as these are pushed to the background, how do we hold all of these things? For those of us who've been talking about intersectionality, how do we hold all these things and act together and against all of these things simultaneously? So radical response, when we talk about radical response, we really look at it as a response that allows us to further expand this continuum of bystander intervention beyond the 5 steps of bystander intervention, which many of you know. Notice the event. 1, 2, interpret the situation as a problem. 3, assume personal responsibility. 4, know how to help. And then 5, step up, right? How do we go beyond that? Think of intervention, intervention as a continuum of actions against a continuum of violence, both intracommunal and intercommunal. How do we organize? We step up, and then what? Do we sit down? How do we organize? How do we engage others? How do we engage in community mobilization? What is our communal work? What is the culture change work? What is the advocacy work? What is the policy work that we must do? Hannah Goldstein from Men Can Stop Rape says, if we can conceive of bystander intervention as a continuum, we broaden the scope of what constitutes an intervention, not only for those predisposed to identifying and fighting gender-based violence, but for those who may not consider themselves as part of this conversation, among them boys and men, right? When you think about gender violence. The same could be said for people of other races or for white folks in terms of addressing white supremacy. And in the next slide, further, Men Can Stop Rape says, bystander intervention is inclusive. Anyone can intervene, and it does not demand ideological mastery of issues surrounding gender-based violence from those who do. One doesn't have to be an activist in the community to intervene in ways big or small. Rather, at the heart of intervention is a singular goal, and one that is not difficult to grasp: mitigate harm. We say yes, and we got to take it further. Next slide. In the urgency of now, we have to take it further, right? In the urgency of now, ideological mastery is required. More conversations, more reading, more experiences, more what are you curious about, more delving deeply into what I believe is, as you all said, right? What I'm curious about is, I dream of. These are ideological, these are all ideological. How do we nurture that? How do we grow that? How do we master that? How do we connect our ideologies with others in order to intervene and create this world that we dream of, and create the communities that we dream of In the urgency of now, human dignity is what is at stake, and it should not be the domain or the right of a privileged few. We need to develop mastery by speaking and participating what it means to actively ensure each other's human dignity. And so, yes, and right to the men can stop rape statement. Next slide, please. So in that further conversation, how many of you are already having conversations about the Breathe Act and the defund movement? I'd love to know. Okay. I see nothing in the chat, but if you are, please say you are. I'd love to know. How many of you have heard of the Breathe Act or the defund police movement? Okay, perfect. Constantly. Okay, it's a given. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Somebody pretty much said, look, we've been talking about this. Yes. So the Breathe Act and as a response to racist violence should not leave out Black women, should not leave out trans women, should not leave out gender nonconforming. It should not leave out women with disabilities, people with disabilities. It should not leave out Indigenous folks. It should not leave out Latinx folks. It should not leave out Asian, brown. It should not leave any of us out. We are in conversation about the Breathe Act to specifically talk about gender identity, gender violence, right? And the lack of gender justice integration within racial justice movements also plays out in community. It plays out in everything we create around racial justice. We've seen it again and again. And so it is our role now to be in community and dialogue about how to undo that. The complexity with the Breathe Act is the complexity we have always been faced with, right? Our safety versus their safety, right? Black women from our communities are being forced to choose their safety or the safety of the men in our communities, their lives or the lives of the men in their communities, right? Black feminists have been talking about this since Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?" She wasn't just talking about her race at that time. She was talking about her gender identity at that time. So given their experiences with oppression, those with whom we live, our brothers, those who we love, those on behalf of whom we mobilize and protest, should be our biggest allies. How do we take engaging men to a whole other level? Next slide, please, as we wrap up. So we still contend at Black Women's Blueprint, and we say it boldly and bravely, and we engage in conversation, in principled struggle around this. And we say that we as an anti-violence field need to be in dialogue and in principled struggle constantly around racial justice movement and the truth of how we choose to intervene and on behalf of who we choose to intervene. The gender justice integration, intersectionality is brilliant. But if it's just in word and not in action, then what is the point? Then we are not meeting that vision, that what we said we believe, that I believe, that I dream of, right? I'm curious about. We understand that racial politics complicates intra-community intervention because of generational trauma linked to the stereotypes of Black men, as well as stereotypes about Black women as rapeable, as stronger than everyone else, as being able to handle all kinds of abuse, right? And being expected to be silent about it and put ourselves last always. And so in the next slide, here's what we believe. Here's what we believe. We can create the conditions for everyone in our communities to have safety and dignity. Whether rape is intracommunal or intercommunal, a rape is a rape is a rape. We want to honor the legacies of survivors and our ancestors. This is a moment for survivors and survivor allies to deeply reflect on a practice of communal honesty, communal accountability, and communal care. To us, that is radical response. And that is imbued in Kansan. And in Kansan is the Adinkra symbol, which represents humanity through unity, responsibility, and interdependence. And so we have a legacy of doing this, going back to legacy, going even further. It's not just in the civil rights movement. It's not just in Black Lives Matter or Mute R. Kelly or, cancel Cosby. It's not just in those movements, but we have a responsibility to each other. This symbol literally means chain, or the chain of humanity in life and death, one blood. It means that every person's involvement, cooperation, and participation has the power to impact everyone's well-being, everyone's safety, everyone's success, everyone's survival. This is especially true for Black, African, and African-American communities, one and the same, used interchangeably. This is true for all of us. Our safety, our survival is intertwined with one another, whether that be inside community, at the intra-community level, or at the inter-community level. And so we are going to end here for this first session. And we thank you for joining us. And I know this last piece was more lecture. Tomorrow we're going to engage in a lot of not just dialogue and breakout rooms, but very interactive talk. So tomorrow, for session 2, it'll be an interactive second session, and it says, as it says here, right, it'll place a heavy emphasis on skill building for community safety and grounding the work of bystander intervention in both empathy and reconciliation. This session is going to provide participants, you will be in practice with each other. It's going to provide us with concrete examples to build empathy among Black men, which are our population, and other marginalized community who both experience and perpetuate violence. So we'll go from there. Session 2, we're inviting you the day after tomorrow, which is Thursday. And we want you to please begin thinking about how we can address problem areas in your specific region, policy shift, culture shift, and overall intervention. So thank you for participating and being here. We have resources in these last few slides. And we are okay with sharing them. So these will be PDF'd and sent to you. So we recommend certain films and shows that you should watch, articles you should read, just et cetera, books. And we thank you for having been part of this amazing, amazing training. It was an amazing experience to connect with you.
Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thanks for joining us.